Hello everyone, today we talk about the early spread of the stirrup. I recently made a video on the development of Carolingian cavalry that is somewhat connected, at least in the broader medieval knighthood playlist, and we're going to make naturally more videos about this technical aspect that of course has received legitimately a lot of attention in the past, it still does in the present. Many people look at the stirrup as the device that starts a sort of revolution, and you know that I loathe with all my possible self this concept applied to anything, right? Historical revolution to me is just like the French and the American Revolution, the Bolshevik one, just because it's called like this conventionally, but not really in that case even applying to a logical degree. There is actually no such thing like a major development in medieval warfare connected with the introduction of the stirrup, right? This gets down to history of science, of technology, of economy. Technology doesn't make tactics. It's tactics that makes technologies that can of course influence by some degree, but that is absolutely marginal in the broader economy of things. And it does not, of course, help in understanding the major changes that were actually, in fact, the most important ones, causing things like the, indeed, pretty sound, concrete, albeit gradual, increase in the shock cavalry charge capacity, the thickly packed formations, the establishment of essentially a professional military class. If we look at 8th century Europe, again, I mentioned that video about the Carolingians just because it's a major theme, of course, in Western warfare, but more or less this can be applied to other levels of Eurasia, other times, other places. And actually, the topic is much more complex than it seems when one expands it, in fact, to the broader horizon. Today's video is in part about this, right? But just summing up essentially the major issues, the major interpretations about the invention, fundamentally, or better, the creation of the stirrup and its spread, particularly. But I will make other videos trying to explain also at a more moral level why. Say, what does the spread of the stirrup tell us about the development of Eurasian horsemanship? And again, what's behind that politically and socially? If you're interested, you know that they have a relatively mini series dedicated to Eurasian steppes warfare, and then for each chapter I talk about different peoples, right, the different waves of steppes, conquerors, explaining essentially what changes diachronically and comparatively between them across the ancient, the medieval, but also the modern era. So that makes you see how, in spite of the fact that the steppes warfare essentials remain pretty much the same, of course there was a modification properly in the background, in the capacities, in material culture of these peoples, and that can help thinking even why these technological auxilia came around, right? If you had interviewed like these warriors like throughout the millennia, it would have likely told you that there was something probably deterior about this reliance on technical devices that were reflecting essentially a collapse in the originally sort of heroic individualistic professionism of the single warrior, right? And of course, the history of civilization goes on, and it makes this effort more concerted. But when it comes to the individual trooper, and this is very important when you realize even why it took not just so long, but let's say why, for example, people were quite close to the places where the stirrup was invented, like the Persians, for example, took so long eventually to adopt it. Right, and you understand that at that point there can't be a sort of universally magical function that the stirrup had just per se, and you have to be able to look beyond and properly at the military cultures of these people. So I think this premise is very crucial. But let's go in some depth into this topic critically. So our reflection stems mostly, given that my channel is being based on mostly Western warfare, what was happening in Carolingian Europe, the time of Charles Martel, the 8th century. And so the moment in which, and this is our one of the departures, well, a proper military class, as we were saying, of professional equestrians was rising to the dominance, essentially, of Western Europe from there in the following centuries, spreading right across the Channel, in the south, in the Mediterranean, in the Levant, in the Baltic, etc. And we will look at this better, of course, in other videos, but it's relevant to observe how this stemmed from a place, just per se, that, for example, was not in the east of Europe, but in the west. Right, this is not to say that Eastern Europe didn't have an equestrian culture, but when you realize that the stirrup was something much more archaeologically, also historically documentable, because of the rise of Western Europe and its heavy cavalry that was actually the superior, basically, to anything it ever met, at least, you realize there already that there is something more about this culture than whichever technical device, Tolkien's stirrup here, was involved, right? The art of riding was surely affected by this broader change, but doesn't mean that the stirrup had much to do with that. If anything, it was subservient to it, functional to it, rather than the other way around. And this thing of the stirrup introduction, also in Western warfare, I think is, it's an interesting topic, but it's been hyper covered. This goes in parallel with when did Western knights began to use the lanks with the couche grip, right? And that's what makes the actual shock cavalry charge function. First of all, it took forever. Like, it was an incredibly gradual phenomenon, but every single horseman had, if he had wanted it, as it did happen to any of them, used it in all possible ways. Underarm, overarm, couche, thrown, right? The lance is being used in the most, even up to very recently in time, and as it is used in every single possible way, right? Because that's what happens in war. And there is not like just a standard way of doing. There is a preferential way of operating, but there are not just, for example, couche lengths, grips, right? Given that knights didn't fight only or prevalently in large, thickly packed, heavy cavalry formations, and this is, often underrated, especially when one thinks of the massive array of technical competence that these guys had, for example, with any single kind of weapon available, right? Knights used every single weapon that existed at the time, best than anybody else, right? But just, we don't see that, right? Because it's not so overly pictured for a number of reasons. Pitched battles are sometimes, even the earlier in time you go, but like less, also not overwhelmingly documented. So we have a massive chunk of the practicality of medieval warfare in its average fashion that sort of goes unnoticed. I will make other videos also from my research showing you what these guys were capable of doing, in terms also, in fact, of dramatic athletic feats on horseback as well that are functional to, in fact, a very different type of combat than just the formation one that is still, again, the prevalent, right? It's like when people say, I don't know, The Roman legionnaire was habituated just to fight in formation. He was not good. The gladius was just a stabbing weapon. Like this kind of garbage, right? If you have any notion whatsoever about actual military history, the Romans or the Franks, whatever we want to talk about, you know that this, of course, doesn't make any sense, and that the first indicator of a military professional is that he's able to carry out collective tactics because he is pretty darn good at individual ones as well, right? And the latter is subordinated to the former, but it's a plus, right? It's a civilizational superiority indicator. It's not, right, a mutually exclusive thing, because the being good individually alone is like the basis, right? The standard pack, right? Then you elevate yourself, and there's not a negative aspect about that because you're basically part of a bigger system. Then, of course, it depends also, because by that level, of course, you're even at some point taking away the necessity of being overly proficient at everything. Think about an 18th century, European fantassin, who surely was not a better warrior than, say, an average Native American one. But of course, we wiped the hell out of the natives without too much of a problem. But when we look at professional individuals, and especially professionals in general, but overwhelmingly more in feudal warfare, you know that that's the standard they can achieve, and so they basically can do pretty much everything. I mean, the 13th century European knight is something that basically tops whatever you can think diachronically having ever happened, right, to the world. In any case, we have to open this long parenthesis if we want to understand how we arrived there and why the stirrup was generalized by that point, for example. So one may start from the very basic question, that is, when does the invention of the stirrup date back to, right? And so there is a wide debate about this. Today we'll not touch on the overwhelmingly intricate issue, at least conceptually, because there, as we'll see now, there's not much of an evidence in the first place of, for example, metal versus organic stirrups, because there are people who think essentially the stirrup came around from late antiquity, and we just don't see it because it was organic, and so not documentable archaeologically, and there is not much of an interest in the sources in the first place to depict it in other ways. This is all very, debatable, but it's not that important, because at the end of the day, what eventually the larger metal stirrup becomes is what is associated with our knighthood focus, right? So that's actually the step that we care about. But of course, right, there is nothing particularly, intelligent in the concept of a stirrup. I mean, it's literally an incredibly banal, simple, cheap, self-evident and obvious thing, right, to create. Like, if you do not stay particularly stable on horseback and you have a saddle, you can't, put your feet into these loops and holding yourself better. Yeah, right, kids did that. I mean, we have it from migration era graves. Even children use stirrups for, riding their ponies and whatever. There's nothing special behind that. The point, again, is what does the stirrup indicate in terms of how these guys fought in the way it developed and that we can track. So there is a jug found in the Chertomlik necropolis in the lower course of the Dnieper River, possibly attributable to the first half of the 4th century BC, right? Which shows essentially how the local inhabitants, the Scythians, tended to their horses. I made some videos about Scythian warfare, so if you're interested, you can check their gear out, because I mostly covered arms and armor, but also tactics and warfare in general, so you can have a context for that if you're not familiar with them. But I assume by watching my channel you're already acquainted with or without my content to to the Scythian military culture. Now this picture, it comes from very accurate work, right? It has been, in fact, attributed to Hellenic artisans for how refined it is. And there are those who have wanted to see next to the padded saddle a stirrup, right? And probably they were wrong, right? But it's possible, at least it's plausible, that a stirrup would have been around among these peoples. Initially, we will see it better later, was a sort of greater bias towards the Scythians, the Sarmatians, when talking about the origins of the stirrup. Today, of course, the horizons have dramatically widened today, from generations now, but it wouldn't be so strange after all. But these peoples were relatively similar, basically, to all the other nomadic ones out there, and especially fighting against the heavies of the sedentary world, infantries that had at times to charge, etc., would have maybe started to increase their stability on horseback for some reason. We will see later what the ultimate conclusion that I have, but it's a concept formulated, generally speaking, by historiography already, did really make the stirrup the one it is. And it's not even a strictly, say, individual need as much as a collective one, right? Or a way in which cavalry formations were employed, and so what this meant specifically for the individual in function of that. I'm just a bit more tranchant in the way I express it compared to the scholarship, but we will get there. In any case, aside from the Chertomlik find, about 2 centuries later, in the 2nd century BC, in a different place, a new type of stirrup, detectable this time, is from Indian sculptures. It is first it's an improper stirrup, we could say, a slow belly band into which the feet can be inserted. So then a simple leather ring to support only the big toe. In short, a stirrup for a barefoot rider, which is not even exactly what at this point most heavies really were, as we will see. I know this kind of Indo-Scythian culture, as it mostly stems from, it's connected definitely with Central Asia in the Indo-Kush, had even segmented armor for their feet, right? But it's possible that through the Indo-Kush, this tool was reaching, in fact, not just the Indian subcontinent, but even China at this point, especially along the same route of the Buddhist missionaries. You know that the founder of the Zen Buddhism was an Hellenic guy from Bactria, right? And that was incidentally also the center of some of the most traumatically advanced cataphract cultures out there. That, however, mostly came from the actual steppes. We're a Saka thing. I described why that happened and why the concept, in fact, of the heavily armored rider had been developing, as we will see even without the stirrup in the steppe. Naturally, by this point, the stirrup had adapted to being worn with shoes as well. Like, it had widened while still maintaining the usual loop shape, which of course makes sense. That is more or less circular, by the way, or irregularly circular, tending to triangularize as well, so not just a hollow circle, but a triangle as well, like being hung at the top, and then you put the foot on the larger foot on the side that is parallel to terrain. And along the Silk Caravan route, this stirrup could have come into contact with the further nomadic peoples of Asia, such as shown by findings in the Altai region. So it's something you have to scope Western Eurasia, especially the triangle between India, the Indo-Kush, specifically Bactria, and some further, northern areas from which, in fact, most of cataphract culture was spreading from among the Iranian peoples. And the steppes presence in that in the Altai and in China is not certain before the 5th century. So fairly late after all. Some think of a different date. Others say that it was there before. Others argue for the 6th, 7th century. So actually, if you look at the time it would arrive, it would become relevant in the West. It's not really a long time away. Also for Eastern Eurasia, right, and Chinese civilization. It is debatable. Bloch wrote like this, speaking of the, let's say, of effect of the later spread of the steppe. The stirrup, according to all appearances, was a gift from those knights of the Eurasian steppes, Alans and Sarmatians, who, through the settlement of several minorities of their people as military colonies in the Roman Empire, in parentheses, I made multiple videos on the topic, their long stay on the Black Sea, and finally the common flight under the onslaught of the Huns, put at the beginning of the Middle Ages in such close contact with the Western world. However, as you understand, Bloch was referring here just to the sort of the Western side of the story, like saying these guys had the steppes, so as far as in Europe we are concerned, that's when they arrived. It's the story that is cool to repeat, that the Alans settled in the West. Yes, but what does this say about the spread of the stirrup specifically, right? The ideas of Bloch were at the time influenced by the works of authors like Arendt and Rostov, so on the importance of the in the field of horsemanship, the Scythians, of the Sarmatians, but there is in fact a much broader world even east of them, and the stirrup, of course, was something, as we've seen, that had emerged from a bit more east than at least the Black Sea, and or at least was mostly developing, as we've seen, around it, the Hindu-Kush, and eventually spreading west and east, if we are correct. Right. So, as far as the stirrup is concerned, today we reason in broader terms, and it's kind of obvious if you look at the chronology involved after generations of research. Now, what must be noted is that in the meantime, speaking of, say, the early Middle Ages by now, from being soft, that is made of leather, the stirrup had become rigid, that is made of metal, making it easier and quicker to use, among the other things. Which tells you already that something was connected, as we will see now, with the idea of jumping on horseback and coming down a bit fast. That is not, say, a matter of simple civilian capacity. It's actually connected with emergential situations, combat, athleticism. So one thing is the soft stirrup that everybody can use just to be a bit more stable on horseback. The other thing is having something more robust you can rely on more, right? Everything would work as an auxilium, right? It's obviously easier to ride with a stirrup, but you have to think also that a nomadic warrior of, say, of late antiquity was just habituated to a kind of horsemanship that, remaining on horseback just per se, more or less stably, was incredible. Was the ABC of how to ride in the first place, just from a physical, athletical point of view. We'll see now how, of course, there were other auxilia used and sort of forgotten because they were mostly made of organic material, like the same soft stirrup could have been some straps, especially consider the use of the contus in combat. Like, you had to keep this barge pole like a spear with both hands without controlling the bridle, and this has important consequences because, first of all, the horse just per se must be trained to go on his own in those circumstances. You must balance yourself mostly with say, not in that sense, not much with your arms. If we're talking about the general body movement, you must be literally strapped to the saddle, and unfortunately we do not know too much about that, but surely that's what even pre horseshoeing and stirrup warfare entailed in many ways, because as we'll see now, warriors were just per se just more athletic, even to an extent. There is no doubt that the passage to the rigid stirrup tells us something more specific about the way these guys were starting to fight. It has to do surely with the increased feudalization of Eurasia at this point, and so what all that entail again on a large scale for cavalry aside, elite cavalry. However, this early rigid stirrup should be thought still of more as an aid for mounting a horse rather than a means of staying more stable in the saddle, yet, especially for the soft stirrup, from which it would be difficult to quickly remove the foot, therefore posing more of a danger than an advantage for the rider. I mean, being dragged by a running horse is much worse than falling off of it. And so consider this yet other aspect, that ancient warriors were much more physically active than us, and especially for these horsemen, the greatest problem, especially we look at the heaviness of their armor, was if anything just mounting on horseback, then maintaining their balance on it, right? Comparatively. In any case, this turning point of the Western equestrian technique from the 8th century, implemented, facilitated, supported by the introduction of the stirrup, was due even to just an accessory use, right? Not and even a partially non-military one. As we were saying, even children in, say, I don't know, Longobards had stirrup, but this had evidently nothing to do with warfare. There's a little girl's tomb with stirrup. Now, this stirrup was mainly exploited for the advantages it offered in terms of stability. Thus, while the reason for its initial diffusion must have been different and reside in its usefulness as an aid to mounting a horse, in part at least. In fact, in the Hellenic and Roman antiquity, one did not, according to the dictionary, mount or dismount a horse. One would jump on, right, or jump off. Like the Latins use this term in equum insilere, or de equo desilere, which means like to just jump or on and off the horse. And the maneuver must have not been particularly difficult for relatively lightly armed horsemen, who also used small mounts such as the Iberians and the Danubians. I made some videos about Iberian and Celtiberian warfare, Cantabrian gallop, the sort of hit and run a la Hineta, as it would have been known in the age of the Reconquista type of tactics, carried out mostly by light horsemen. They were cataphracts, among the Iberians at some point, just something extremely expensive and so just present in small quantities. But overall, like the sense that these guys, and especially in fact in the sedentary ancient world, not having a feudal society that only a people like the Macedonians had, and not even to the extent of the much more heavily armored sagas, for example, that actually increased their own armoredness exactly to cope with Alexander's armies on the Daria, for example, because they had to cope against infantries, would have been much more socially egalitarian to some degree. That's the reason why you cannot have actually a very strong, in this case decisive cavalry, even if you don't have a feudal society. Right? In Western Europe, you look at the Celts, you look at the Germans, you look at the Italics, you look at the Dacians, you have cultures that are at large aristocratic but not oligarchic, but still the average person has that enough of wealth to prevent the aristocracy to simply develop a more powerful system of potential political and social subjugation. All the Indo-European peoples in Europe, in sedentary Europe, are fixated to an enormous extent with equestrian culture, right? The Romans, the Greeks, the Germans, they have militaries based on infantry. And some peoples like the Germans in particular have actually the least equestrian, the least cavalry development of all in Europe, but they're traumatically fixated with horses at every level of their mythology, of their idea of the hero. The Romans had basically the same system that the medievals would use, a knight that, in virtue of the privilege of its own sacred connection above all the rest of the citizenry, had to be paid by the community. It seems like the restaur in medieval Europe, right, in a feudal context. But not only, like also in communal ones, for example, still cavalry dominated. But these guys are not as heavy as, in fact, providing like the decisive element, unlike the steppes, right? And this is, I think, the very important connection, that what you see during the migration era is that these sedentary European populations pass from a superior infantry in the balance to a superior cavalry. And fundamentally, with the migration era, what we can see as a proto-feudal culture kicks in, at least to an unprecedented degree than before, and hence during the Middle Ages you see actually this system, even with the expansion of the system, even of the infantries, etc., maintaining the upper hand and generating, in fact, that kind of heavy cavalry that also needed, for the reasons we will see now, the stirrup. The previous guys didn't. I made multiple videos on ancient cavalry, by the way. There's a playlist dedicated to that specifically, so if you're interested in seeing, I don't know, what Thessalian cavalry looked like in the 5th century BC. And so also some of the finest, in fact, mounted arm of ancient Europe was like, you can't see how particularly light it was compared to feudal Europe in the Middle Ages. All right. There is this aspect of the individual warrior. Then there is still the required training, the agility, some space, that if performed simultaneously by an entire unit, it would create a moment of general imbalance and confusion. The stability of a horse without shoeing, for example. The Greeks had the hippos handles, for example. The Celts had the horn saddle that sort of with weight sort of flexed and it tightened the thighs, but these were all very precarious means of maintaining yourself on horseback. Ancient cavalries in the sedentary world did charge, and they charged the hell against the enemy with terrible, shocking impact, but nothing comparable to what was happening in Central Asia and what would happen in medieval Europe itself. And so an interesting region to observe that we mentioned in the beginning to see a part of this transition is Persia, that always remained in the Iranian plateau very much of an hybrid between the nomadic world and the sedentary civilization. It's a hybrid, really. The plateau is quite wide. The northeastern part is sort of more savage. The southwestern one is closer to Mesopotamia. And so there you can see a very interesting blend that eventually overflows. Think about Achaemenid times or the Sasanian ones, so that you have this sort of hinge between the steppe and the sedentary world, but from a standpoint that mixes the two military tradition. And Persian cavalry was heavily armed, notoriously used. I made a video about the Achaemenid heavily armored horsemen. We talked here and there about also the Sasanian ones. Just recently made a video about the half-armored horse of the second half of the 6th century in a Byzantine context, but basically being almost the same of Iran. Now, the Persians, for this reason, had been developing beefier mounts. Right? They used especially tall horses. Right? Xenophon describes these animals like some sort of elephants, of course exaggerating, but giving an idea of what this horse really was. I made a video about the Persian horse proper, actually. So if you're interested in the connection with the Nicaean one, which was actually the same race, and in fact the heavenly breed that was imported by the Chinese from the Central Asians, from the Aryans, you can find all of that. And Persia definitely has a feudal culture by being a sedentary country, so that's why it's interesting. And in the case of Persian cavalry, each rider constantly needed a valet to help him mount in his mount. That society had developed proper in a sort of, again, of a feudal fashion. It was like medieval knight, even in ancient times. It was, especially in the Sasanian one, it had developed to an important extent, but did it from also before. You would have all a series of attendants, of also complementary fighters that would be part of your retinue, because this cavalry was so heavy that it needed some sort of support in the camp, on the battlefield, and so you understand it's also more complexly used. At least it's part of a sort of importantly developed army and tactics, and in the art of war this brings to the functionalization, in fact, of the same charge to a degree. Xenophon called this practice of being helped to mount on horseback because of the weight of your armament and because of the size of the horse, in fact, the Persian way, which began to spread more and more, right, even in the Roman army, along with the increase of the cataphract cavalry. That is something which, in that case, differently from the Middle Ages, as we will see now, did come from, at least more from Persia, or at least, to an important degree and direct way from Persia, not just the northern, let's say, the steppes. That's probably also overlooked. I mean, definitely the Romans had a very close contact with peoples like the Sarmatians. I made a video specifically on this to adopt, in fact, this cataphract cavalry that actually would never work quite well. I mean, the Romans had this hell of a military. During the 4th century, you have the Constantinian reforms, and you have actually the single most tactically performing Roman army that ever existed. when compared to previous times. And you realize that the only element of the Roman army that sort of sucks, that is failing basically in major battles, is this copy of the cataphracts that technically is an artificial one, because the Romans do not have a feudal society, but they are so powerful, and their state, especially in late Roman times, so dirigistically structured that they can sort of try to imitate this. This is what the Byzantines will keep doing later, also with an important degree of success. But the cataphract and the heavier form of this had stemmed essentially from the Arsacid one. The Arsacids, so the Parthians, if you prefer, like dynasty and people respectively as a name, are actually the guys who topped the heaviest cataphract forms that we see historically, at least in Western Eurasia. The Sasanians didn't have actually heavier, at least more armored cavalry, right? It tended to split the function. This early Parthians were still so much part of that sort of individualistically, let's say, warrior step, that they still contemplated the idea of using the shock force together with the bow, for example, like with the single knight doing a bit everything. Then the Aesites to, like, of course the Parthians are more, the Arsacids are more primitive in their time than the Sasanians. But they still got it, right? They actually have lots of problems in the art of war. They suck at siege warfare. They do not develop a major state like the Sasanians do in Mesopotamia. But they come earlier, right? Let's be honest about this. Also, the Sasanians had been massively Romanized in especially in polyurcetics, in sort of technical influence, etc. But these are the guys which basically circulate during the first centuries of the Common Era, and that the Romans also modeled their full cataphracts, horse and horsemen, fully cataphracted, fully armored, albeit both in Persia and in Rome, but eventually abandoned by late antiquity, because they are not, consistently the 6th century, like at least there is a major crisis had kicked in. There are less resources, but in general, right, you also have, and this is something that the Byzantines, for example, will find out later with the Nicaphorian cataphracts, etc., this sort of revival of this very Hellenistic in mindset. Let's use the super weapon like the seated chariot or the armored elephant or the sophisticated torsion engines and whatever. But eventually they do not fully integrate. Like you have, first of all, very small chance of using them in terms of cost-benefit ratio positivity. Yes, they can smash everything you find on the battlefield, but only if you pave them the way. Like if the enemy at last is exhausted, it has only another battle left, and you're lucky you can handle this logistically and strategically, because it's extremely expensive. Like the cataphract is super heavy stuff, and it costs a disproportional lot, right? But sometimes it is fitting. In others, it can actually be taken out even by lighter troops. I mean, look at the much lighter German cavalry at the Battle of Argentoratum against the Romans, right? The Roman cataphracts basically collapsed, and in fact, the Romans almost lost the battle because their right was uncovered there. It's the Celto-Germanic auxilia that actually saved the day for them. But just to make an example of what we're talking about in diachrony. So in this context, the stirrup did become a tool, the absence of which was particularly felt among those peoples who used too heavy equestrian equipment, or horses of too high a size, or who, not being of high stature in general, found themselves disadvantaged in jumping for a reason or another. And observations of this kind lead us to look at Central Southern Asia, where we have seen that it is precisely from India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and China that we get the first evidence of the stirrup spread and its further development, modifications. Right. For example, the great military reform of Wu Ti, who had organized heavy cavalry under the pressure of the Xiongnu, predisposed the use of the stirrup. Right, the Chinese, as we were saying before, carried out this important reform between the first century BC, to copy a bit like what the Romans do with the Parthians, except here it's even more extreme divide. Right, the Romans and the Parthians paradoxically were more similar than the Chinese and the Xiongnu, for example. To a large extent, and they need, in order to cope with these steppe warriors, unequal cavalry of that kind. And the Chinese have massive resources; they can invest in replicating the actual cavalry, the heavies, to cope with the steppe one, even to an important degree of success. Other peoples around were influenced by this. Just yesterday I was talking about Korean warfare, and actually people like that had apparently even better cataphracts than the Chinese did, even though they were not nomads. The Chinese import horses. They have some pastures also close to the nomadic frontier. They want really to have all the necessary resources to never run out of these guys, and creating something more structurally shocking, right, from a tactical point of view to cope with those guys. And it's worth noting, by the way, that the 6th century saw the same stirrup spreading from China towards Japan on one side and towards Central Asia on the other. And the Chinese had ingrained so much in Han times the use of the stirrup. Remember that, like when the time of the peak of the Roman military, like the Chinese picking themselves had stirrups, the Romans didn't. Right? This doesn't necessarily mean that the Chinese were sort of more ahead, for sure. There were technically and possibly some clashes between the Romans and the Chinese, or at least in particular contexts I could make a video on. But just think how different in some ways these two major sedentary empires were in terms of tactical styles. Not overwhelmingly, I mean the essentials are the same, but the degree by which they could be able to replicate, for example, a more the Chinese were more feudal and equestrian than the Romans. Right, this is important to stress. So it doesn't mean that their infantry, for example, was at the same level. Some say yes. I mean, they had very high level of military organization, but at large, it was also a much more unbalanced society. As we were saying before, Europe had actually, I think, the highest level of per capita wealth. Right, I mean, the Roman legionary emerges from Italy exactly from that kind of wealth distribution. So it's also a completely different mentality as a consequence. In China, instead, peasants are just garbage, but they are at a higher metaphysical level, than just being a poor person in the Roman Empire, right? That was very, again, socially stratified. We would tend to ignore that, but it's very different from what everything under heaven, from what the kin were doing in their own way. And perhaps we'll make some other video on this. But it's interesting, you see that, a country like Japan could be understood because, after all, China is just in the front and sort of this massive military influence. Japan's not reached otherwise by steppe culture. They get the stirrup from the Chinese. But the fact that certain parts of Central Asia would receive the Chinese stirrup type, for example, when they technically had known the stirrup already from a while, is remarkable. And part of this mechanism that happens in the 6th century bear in mind here migration era, further feudalization, etc., can have to do, in fact, with the social changes in those societies as well. This is basically the last century of Iranian domination of the steppe, and by that point, the Iranian peoples had substantially sedentarized by steppe standards. They had created powerful seigneuries, castles, etc., but this was also, like, in part, it's their gentrification, their sclerotization. Then they collapsed, there's a major destabilization. The Turks arrive, and they actually don't have the same quality back in the day the Iranians had, but they are able to overrun them. And so, in the process, the Turkic Mongol peoples received the stirrup from the Chinese, rather than from the Iranians that had sort of, dominated, even though those peoples much more east than we usually think, right? Some say that the Chinese Empire was founded by Indo-Europeans back in the foggy mythical past. Well, it wouldn't be strange if you think about that, if you look at the chronology, the spread of the war chariot and more. In any case, again, the Turks, the Mongols received the stirrup largely from the Chinese, and by a time that had already been known by the Scythians, the Sarmatians. So this return, we can define it like this adoption, perhaps explains, at least in part, why the stirrup did not penetrate until relatively late Europe. There is a huge debate, again, when this happened, especially because of the organic material. Some say that the stirrup was around since the 5th century, say in the Roman army, but being organic, it cannot be documented. But it's not much about when the stirrup was introduced ever. Again, there is nothing to understand about a stirrup. There is nothing special about the concept. It's not something that somebody had to invent because you do not arrive to the concept. It's something that, again, even a child can come up with. The point is, again, why we see also the greatest spread during the 7th, 8th century, and from there on also a permanently structural employment that eventually increases gradually to become sort of standard, right? Still on the Bayeux tapestry, not all the Norman horsemen wear the stirrup. Also, among those peoples that could have benefited from the stirrup the most, as we were saying before, Xenophon described pretty massive beasts used by the heavy Persian knights. There are the latter, in fact, sons of a land so close to that original India of the new invention that really makes you wonder why apparently they wouldn't adopt the stirrup until fairly late, right? There is an interesting vocabulary aspect, that is the word used by the Persians to designate the stirrup is rikab, which is not Iranian, is Arabic. And so some scholar pointed out that this may indicate that the stirrup would have entered into common use when the Persian establishment already spoke Arabic after the Islamic conquest in the 7th century, and thus pretty late. And by another people, technically, that was not even particularly equestrian. I mean, the Arabs basically called it the entire Persian pack, right, as far as, including religion, by the way. And, I mean, the jihad is purely like Zoroastrian holy war. If you look at like the essentials, but not only, right? The let's say that eventually the caliphate would draw a shocking amount of massive structural foundation in terms of military culture from, again, either the Byzantines or the Persians, and the latter, especially as far as everything feudal and military nature would entail. And the same ghulams later to think about the Oghuz, the Seljuks, they were would be heavily, especially in the last case, heavily Persified, even though they were nomads themselves, and so all this knightly, even technical capacity kicking in, but apparently Persia having not much to do with the development of the stirrup, so there is not apparently a connection between the two things. Even though we should always be careful with the chronology and just with the evidence in general, because we know too few, right? It's not that we have a clear idea what was happening, say, in 6th century Iran, like to the point of saying, oh, well, we know exactly how much the stirrup spread and which ways and whatever, right? One has to have a massive historical and archaeological awareness to even just point out some, decisive theories about this. So definitely the linguistic argument of the Arab word for stirrup in Iran is not probating. And it was certainly for mounting a horse that the Persians had to greatly appreciate the stirrup anyway, perhaps less for what concerned the handling at full speed of their heavy lances, that, as we were saying before, just required you to stay on horseback, and that even at impact, these ancient warriors had developed an art, which in fact they had been masters for centuries, and for which there was already a different system of balance. If we do not want to speak of a different system of the stirrup, and simply because we cannot document it from one side, but if you think about those theories about the various straps that the average Saka or I don't know, even our Sassid cataphract would have had, well, why not a stirrup as well? If you are literally like tied with these things to the horse, and this can be quite literally so. I mean, even during the Middle Ages, we know from Arab sources in Spain that Christian knights literally anchored themselves to the saddle, because at the moment of impact, they would have been otherwise catapulted, right, very far away from their horses. And that's what technically happens. Cavalry charges were carried out, the heaviest, the horse, by the way, literally smashing to something that comes at the same speed against you. We're talking normal charge, something like 45 kilometers per hour at canter. Just imagine smashing into something that comes 45 kilometers per hour against you when you're already at 45 kilometers per hour. It's just smashing into a wall at 90 kilometers per hour, right? It's just playing a Russian roulette. That's how spiritually selected these individuals were. And so the last of their concern in many ways was also the technicality, at least to the extent for which for them it seemed something normal and that would just adapt to their customs, but was not particularly documented because it was just a trivial aspect of the whole pack. There is another argument in favor of the further need for the stirrup handling, that is the additional advantage that this device provides when you have to handle the sword, right? The stirrup allows more force to be given to the blow, even rising, in fact, from the saddle, and providing the weapon not only the momentum of the arm, but the weight of the entire torso, which is true. Essentially what you do is by, sticking your foot into the stirrup is also developing greatly, like standing up, right? And of course with your muscles, and this is actually the counter argument, these warriors could do this by themselves already, right? If you wanted to erect yourself on the from the back of the horse, just to deliver a heavy blow, like with a spada, for example, well, the stirrup would have helped you, but this doesn't mean, and also because we do not have a camera showing how these guys actually fought, but we can think they were, you know, quite athletically versed to do so, to just perform the same without this auxilium, right? In fact, such other point can be just of relative value, since we really ignore too much about the equestrian technique, the specific skill of an ancient knight, that surely from a bodily point of view was able to surpass also many of the limits that we think of, wow, we wouldn't use this help. The guy was beyond, right? Our knowledge of his tools alone is not sufficient to fully grasp the quality of the performance that could derive from them. So it is therefore not excluded that the stirrup, as we know it, would penetrate late into Persia, for example, with all her knights, precisely to the functionality of the previous system of mounting on the horse and balancing on it, a system, as we've seen, probably made of organic material compensated by just the force of these guys that were reluctant to abandon in the first place. And the development of the second bow of the saddle up to the size of a sort of backrest, which was happening in those years, must indeed have determined by the need to provide a point of support that would prevent backward balance, right, losses, which in a rider using the stirrup, especially if handling the lance, the bow, and a long sword for slashing, can run the risk of being dragged by the animal. That was, as we've seen, the same concern after all, the Celtic saddle, or any actual, development of the first forms that were becoming, in fact, at this point, pretty big, right? Pretty high, pretty tall. The Persians had sort of box they sat in, and that could be an indicator, telling the truth, not much of a, however, of a regular imbalancement because of the moves that the horseman was just naturally performing. Yet the increasing shock force of deriving from the cavalry charge that may have been increasing at this point because of that process of feudalization. So the point is, the stirrup starts at some point to come on the fore, also for these countries, in the moment in which there is some sort of feudalization and professionalization. There is an entire military class that detaches it from the masses for good, and that basically is ever more collectively trained to a degree that, as we will see now, will just make these guys charging not blindly, but in an ever more steamrolling fashion. That is to say, if you stop, you're just putting the formation at risk, and so you have just to accept you have to smash into the enemy because you're part of a bigger group, right? A more structured one. That is more feudal in nature. You see, these early medieval armies were definitely not bigger than the ones of the early times, but they were much more imbalanced in terms of internal organization. You had a much more elite force and much sort of auxiliary forces rather than sort of a larger scale combined arms. So in other words, cavalry has, at least the elite one, has to smash ever more directly into the enemy. And this is actually, as a spoiler also for the end in Europe, the reason why the stirrup was spreading. Because it's not that would have not been incredible impacts at any time in cavalry warfare, but the regularized, systematic shock charge by large formation that literally didn't have to even look into what they were smashing because they were just being carried away. And at best they had just to maintain alignment, which was a very difficult thing, but still they had to act as a wall mass to effectively deliver that blow successfully, may have generalized the use of the stirrup that was still kind of useful, but mostly had to help you absorbing the enemy impact by developing, by the way, health-like muscles in the process, right? Because that's eventually what the saddle really does. And as we were seeing before, and we'll see now with other examples, doesn't mean that these guys before didn't have already very developed, for example, thigh muscles, right? So there is nothing even in their aggrandizing necessary from a single individual physicality in this passage. If anything, the contrary, right? The stirrup may have been an indicator that individual heroism was now just being supplanted to a sort of emergential precautional measure by this device. So a guy that would mostly stay on saddle to smash into the enemy, but without being, for example, that mobile like it had been traditionally before. And this may have come even at parity of heaviness. As we were saying before, the old Saka hero was a guy that was technically able to perform both shock charges and bow shooting at the same time. Eventually the Sasanians split this from Arsacids times, and everything gets sort of less pumped up, right? Less pressured, more civilized, but sort of individually weaker. So that may be actually the part of the story. As for the Byzantines, repeated mentions of the stirrup are found in the Strategicon of the Pseudo-Maurice. Made multiple videos on that, on some of the peoples described, but we will come back on the Byzantine part also more, and contribute to dating it. The spread of the stirrup by this indication, not at the end of the 6th century, but at the beginning of the 8th, even for the Byzantines actually, because it's all in all like pretty scanty. Considering also the tactics described, like the emphasis on this element, it's just cursory. And given the continuous relations with the Sasanians, despite the fact they had become, of course, they were always enemies before or after the Islamic conquest, whatever, but there was a lot, of course, of warfare and as such, a lot of hybridization of the two cultures. It is indeed almost impossible that the technique and equipment of the Byzantine cavalry wouldn't proceed hand in hand with the Persian one. Again, I recently made that video that basically describes their cavalry, their horse armor specifically, and that you can't even find a difference. And yet, we should be careful about this, because it's not to be even for granted that even though the stirrup was evenly distributed in the same ways. There were increasing similarities in these people's warfare, mostly because of the feudalization of both systems. The Byzantines in the 6th century are much more close to a sort of feudal world than they had been, for example, in the 5th. Right? There is no doubt about this, even though they would never become like what we would conventionally call a feudal society. In any case, that pattern was maybe uneven. Maybe both were increasing in the use of stirrup, but because of these preconditions, they were at different places. Because again, Byzantine society was not feudal, but Persian one, yes. The Byzantines lived, generally, aside from their federati, their symakoi, their federati that they adopted in large numbers, still, sort of more civilized context than these, but also than the Persians. So the question is also, is it really and prevalently through the Persians via that the Byzantines received the stirrup, and is this valid also for Western Europe? As we're saying since the beginning, the main problem in answering this question lays in the fact that the archaeological traces of these dynamics are pretty scanty, to say the least. However, also in other videos, we have pointed out how today, the most credited theory is still that the Avars played a major role in this introduction. Not necessarily in the spread. We will see now what difference it makes, because that is mostly a social based thing, and so how it reflects in the military, but not by contact. Like, peoples do not, again, aside from the fact that technologies can appear in different countries at the same time, but the world is so intertwined, right? Against all the myths of the Dark Ages, where people did not travel, did not know. They knew pretty damn well a lot of things, and again, there is nothing genial in the concept of a stirrup for having to wait the steps guys to bring it to you. But the Avars have surely something to do with this, and it does seem, of course, that the Byzantines received the stirrup and a great deal of other military cultural influence from the Pontic steppe rather than from Persia. I'm also made a video about, for example, how the Byzantine pavilion in the imperial camps were drawn from the Avar type, and all this major steppe influence that definitely during the migration era is injected in European warfare at large. The Avars settled in Pannonia towards the end of the 7th decade of the 6th century. At that point, allying with the Longobards to drive out the Gepids that were settled essentially in the Carpathian Basin on the Middle Danube. And then, albeit remaining allies with the Longobards, prompting the latter to move towards Italy, because definitely the Avars, aside from the fact that Italy is a great decoy, but and note, it's not the Avars that settled there, right, but the Longobards, and of course, Italy's civilization, Pannonia, is something distinctly far from that, especially after the Avars also arrived. Now, the Longobards were by that time already skilled in the art of riding. Surely they were capable of handling the two-handed spear, Contas style from the migration era, in combination as a trooper type with the Spada longsword. Indeed, the Longobards had received a massive steppe influence, especially under the Huns that they abandoned sort of at the latest of their Central European empire, even though their actual say segmentation suggests that they were at heart, like the elites would mostly tend to imitate the overlords, but the rest of the people, it was also pretty well balanced, socially speaking, and well armed, well equipped. This was very useful against the Gepids, for example, who were much more crippled by very poor people but very rich oligarchy, and with a very Germanic fascist, let's say. So you would expect with this kind of influences the problem of balance in the saddle to be of close concern for them, right? Germanic peoples did not have major saddle developments. They were still pretty exposed again to steppe warfare, but having to cope with it, in fact, in their own terms. So we do find, for example, stirrups in the Longobard burials, and we have to ask ourselves, like, did they bring it with them because of some other contact, right? The fact that they used, for example, the skrammas axe as a side weapon, but in some cases even 70 centimeters long, so like a sort of saber, and that, however, is too short to be effectively used from horseback without any support point, could at least suggest that they must have some kind of auxilium to stay on horseback. Meaning what? Meaning that if you have a shorter weapon that you use a lot also on horseback, presumably together, however, with the longer spada, let's remember that you may have needed to stretch out more to reach the enemy. And so people say, oh, they should have had just habitually the stirrup in their cavalry at that point. But again, by hypothesizing this, as usual, we overestimate the equipment and underestimate the equestrian skill. What these guys were capable of doing on horseback was really great by sedentary standards. The Byzantines and the pseudo-strategicans say, by the way, that the Germans were able to charge pretty hard, except they were not particularly ordered. Yet, so you have this impact capacity, but also some more reliance often on foot, especially when they were surrounded, when things go wrong. So this suggests, especially in this frontier, that it wasn't necessarily such an orderly development of a collective shock charge in, let's say, in the structured way that, of course, would arise by the 8th century, for example. Even among the Longobards, that by that point had lost a great part of their sort of equestrian tradition, at least in that sort of migration era, Central European steppe influence style, just like the Franks. I mean, you can't say that the Franks of Charles Martel were so influenced by steppe warfare as, you know, like they were in the 5th and the 6th century, even though they were properly from the far end of the Germanic territories compared to the steppes influences. Still, they had a lot of them, and so there is no solid evidence that the Avars and the Longobards would make a particularly large amount of stirrup use. Again, they had it, we know that, but is this technically influencing their warfare that much? There are other questions on the table. Again, the Avars are still somehow credited, mostly by the studies of Werner that are pretty dated, but still, you know, not disputed as far as this aspect. It would be this Avars, or the Bulgars, for example, their neighbors, that arrived with these stirrups in Europe. But the spread is another question. I mean, were we to answer, were the Avars likely to, to be the people that made more extensive use of the stirrup in Europe around these times, let's say the 6th, the 7th century? Likely yes, right? Because likely they had taken them from somebody further east that made them at least the westernmost people to have it more spread apart. Between the Avars and the Longobards, were definitely more likely from the first to have had, as they did, stirrup on a more regular basis than the latter. The question is also, did the Avars get influence in stirrup use by the Byzantines or the Sasanians? What was the situation, for example, when they migrated from Central Asia? What was happening there? This is not a simple set of questions to answer, right? But this opens also to the theory that the stirrup would have journeyed from Asia to Western Europe to this northern route, so north of the Caspian Sea, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea, independently from the southern one constituted by Persia and Constantinople. And on this too, there are lots of questions open, meaning, is it possible that the Avars, for example, did not, or the Bulgars, or this other prevalently Turkic peoples, wouldn't actually have received much of stirrup influence from the Chinese, for example? The Avars did witness, for example, this in siege warfare. Think about the Sino-Avar Mangano, or other elements of their military culture that surely maintained contacts with the steppes even after they had settled in Carpathian Basin, for example. And the question is also, like, in the Pseudo-Maurice we do find the stirrup, we do find also the dating of that manual is relatively debated, but getting too picky about these details, I think, is missing the bigger picture, that is to say that the stirrup was already around, even, and that here we have rather to understand what was the background of each and every one of these peoples to require its use in larger or smaller terms, right? So I wouldn't focus too much on that. I just say that the Avars are considered the people that was mostly connected with at least the earliest, more systemic use of the stirrup on the road, right? And in part because of their essentially oligarchic nature, the fact that the steppe was getting pretty feudal in its own kind. The Avars were very successful people who were, for example, much tougher, militarily speaking and technically, than what the Huns had been. The great archaeologist Joachim Werth had dated the introduction of the stirrup among the Avars, and generally in the Danubian area at large, in the second half of the 6th century. Today we do not really think that this is wrong, as in as much as the spread of the stirrup, in spite of this, did not really take off until a couple of centuries later, which again must have been triggered by something else rather than a people's movement. Right, a people's movement could even fuel the increase of feudalization because of state failure, of privatization, etc. But it doesn't mean that, for example, Europeans at large were waiting for the Avars just to introduce the steppe and to starting imitating it for some reason. In this way, we arrive at the end of the 7th century, which makes it impossible not to notice that it's in this period that the stirrup spreads substantially among especially peoples like the Persians, the Byzantines, and the Avars, highlighting how its use by the Longobards was at this point modeled after the Byzantine example rather than the Avar one, interestingly enough, since there were at least not so intense contacts between the Avars and the Longobards after the 3rd quarter of the 6th century. This aspect can be debated to an extent. I mean, the Longobards, I made a video about medieval Friuli that explains this, were essentially not invaded by the Avars as a whole people, right? Just that the northeastern frontier was ravaged every once in a while, but there are a couple of episodes fundamentally. Yes, there was some frontier warfare, but that's not what brings with raids and skirmishes, like, for example, the entire Longobard kingdom, just to be particularly in that there are not major campaigns against the Avars or things like that. It's just the local dukes in northeastern Italy that take matters in their own hands, and generally speaking, the kingdom develops on the basis of Lombardy and Tuscany. The Byzantines instead are in Italy, but they're also becoming ever more Italian by themselves. I mean, the subject had always been, and say that the Greek presence declines sharply, especially here in the 7th century with the Islamic invasions. Like, Italy becomes sort of the centralized area that Constantinople cares relatively about, and especially from the Longobard side, that they gave even the latter sort of the acceptance of their current territorial control in the peninsula. The fact that in the 7th century Persians, Byzantines, and Avars start making more use of the stirrup is fascinating, because definitely Persians and Byzantines are in deep crisis, not to say something else. The Avars are actually, like by the end of the 7th century, at least declining. But in this sense, their oligarchies are also increasing in importance compared to the sort of the freemen And so you have some sort of feudalization based on a sanitary basis. That is this irreversible process that basically all the nomadic peoples undergo when they settle in Europe. Doesn't matter whether in Hungary you have the steppes, but basically it's a very different reality from where these guys were coming from in just the Eastern European steppe, for example. There is an interesting, speaking still of Longbird archaeology, just a note, in the necropolis of Castel Trozzino there are stirrups in the Tomb 41, if I remember correctly. This seemed to date back to the 8th century. It's not that clear, because after all, like 7th, 8th, like how do you even try to date them? They're stirrups, by the way, so there's nothing particularly identificative in that. So the Longbirds would have been using it, the steppe, the stirrup, even before that. In the fact, however, that the stirrup appears at this time, and we assume that this is the 8th century, makes it more or less at the same time the Franks did, which means what? That again, stirrups did not exist before. Yes, they existed. It's pretty clear by all the hints we have, and especially this kind that is fully formed and sort of, in metal and effective for mounted combat, etc. So already from this chronology, Longobards and Franks, 8th century, realized that their societies were starting to produce, especially the Franks, that sort of basilatic beneficiary system that eventually the Carolingians imported in Italy after the conquest of the peninsula, etc. And that belongs to the broader Carolingian Europe, in fact the post-Carolingian kingdoms later, and so the military class of high medieval Europe, Western Europe. Every consideration on how much did the Franks and the Longobards differ in terms of, for example, equipment, material culture, is nonsensical. They had the same identical weapons. That was not the discriminant. Like, it was Frankish society to be much more oligarchic and to have developed private clienteles. There weren't such things among the Longobards, but still, like, the trend was going toward that direction. So again, 8th century general revival, but also certain groups become richer than others. They tend to feudalize at least more, right? The Franks considered the Longobards still better horsemen because back in the day they knew the gods. The Longobards were the best among the Germans at riding, but objectively by the 8th century the Franks had surpassed them, right? And again, you have that video about Charles Martel's cavalry. That well, it's not about his, and specifically we still have to make a video about Carolingian cavalry as a military unit, for example. In any case, the dating system is not so relevant. Paul the Deacon, in his History of the Longobards, we are essentially in Charlemagne's times, speaks of Authary. That was one of the late 6th century, early 7th century kings of the Longobards. And this guy, at a point, there's a very interesting story. He goes basically to Bavaria, without being recognized, like with a group of Longobards as a delegation, but he doesn't reveal that he's a king. And he goes to find, because they had to negotiate the marriage with Theodolinda, the Bavarian princess. And there's all the stories, very interesting. At some point we can talk about it. This episode we narrate here is from the Storia Longobardorum 330. And basically the guy reveals himself while he comes back to Italy. They arrive at the border between Bavaria and Lombardy, and the guy, because this guy had fixed the kingdom, had basically established it, and territorially speaking, he basically elevates himself from the saddle, and he throws a throwing axe into a tree, and he says, "This is how Authary strikes." So he reveals himself. And the term that Paul the Deacon uses in Latin to depict authoring the act of rising in the saddle to strike a blow is erexit sequantum super equum cui presidebat potuit, which means literally he elevated himself as much as he could over the horse. And so some people have interpreted this passage as, oh, the guy had the stirrups, right? And again, no, right? Knights, horsemen like him, here we're talking about the Longobards elite, by the way, so these guys were, again, combat machines from quite an early age, killing lots of people, spending their entire life on horseback, whatever. Of course, this guy had two massive ties that could simply elevate him above the horse while for throwing the axe, which is a beautiful move. Think about this, because that's how much, again, what I was saying before, individually proficient these guys were with weapons. Of course, he strikes perfectly against the tree with a perfect aim, and that's to say, we are the Longobards, we do like this, I am the king. That's our territory. So some people said, well, maybe Paul the Deacon was writing in Carolingian times, was thinking about a guy from his own times, most preferably would have fought with a stirrup. Well, not really, because first of all, the stirrup was not so widespread yet. We'll see now that the 8th century witnesses a systemic spread of the stirrup, but still as a minority device, as we were saying before in the Bayeux tapestry. So essentially 300 years later shows, and there we're talking about the Western Frankish kingdom, so the single most advanced equestrian culture ever. The Normans only with some stirrups, like it's not by no means a standard thing, considering that the nuns that depicted that made the tapestry like decided scientifically to represent just some identical types of heavy cavalrymen, a guy with the stirrup and the other without, right? So it would have been iconic at that time to still be that between, right? It's not until I think the third quarter of the 12th century that everybody literally has a stirrup. So 100 years after Hastings, specifically, right? But again, we tend to underestimate insultingly how athletic these knights were and how much they would have played this stunts on horseback without the need of a stirrup. So even if the Avars had this primacy in stirrup use in Europe, that would have been the top ones. The spread of the stirrup among them archaeologically is dated between the 7th and the 8th century. Right? There is a major problem with the dating, by the way, or actually the evidence availability, that, as you know, with Christianization, people stopped burying their dead in arms, including their horses. Right? The Longobards do in the by essentially the 8th century, don't do it anymore. Well, as we just said with Castel Trosino, the chronology is disputed, but of course it was a gradual process, not ex abrupto, but the same goes for the Franks. The Alemanni still do it in the 8th, but they are basically the exception. The Avars, by the time they're crushed by Charlemagne, well, some are Christian, but they are still essentially pagan. So we can document that during the 7th, the 8th century, when the Avars still raided as far as Italy, Bavaria, Thuringia, and Franconia, and that German connection is very important because the Merovingian Germany was often harassed by and much more in depth that you see than Italy, that was just a frontier thing, than that by the Avars. Shows essentially the Avars that have been in the phase of development of the stirrup use for evidently some sort of more cohesively mounted warfare style of fighting. The Avars are not particularly, let's say, stable politically. They are at least growing weaker. Charlemagne will wipe them out, as you know. But they were still essentially going towards a direction, and that was definitely a feudalizing one, but just like the Magyars did later. And it does seem in this sense that Merovingian or even early Carolingian Germany was an important area where the stirrup could have been adopted, especially by the Franks, to a larger extent. At least this is a place where this heavier horsemen, from at least in their steppes influence, may have showed the Franks certain technical levels that eventually would have turned useful in the moment in which the latter were developing their own cavalry as well, that needed, however, the steppe that was already known by them before the Avars, or right around there, but in a time in which the Franks had pretty much nothing to do with the feudal system that paradoxically they would pioneer themselves to a shocking degree later on. The Carolingians, as we just said, are the same ones that destroy the Avars in the early 9th century. So whatever technicality the Avars owned ethnically, traditionally, the Franks beat them, and so they were superior to them by that point. And so today we generally share this opinion, supported especially by some archaeological findings in Württemberg, that is technically Alemannia, so southwestern Germany, not even the east, that in fact the Westerners would come into some sort of true and stable syntony with the stirrup in the first half of the 8th century. And this, as we've seen in the video about the making of Carolingian cavalry, is of course the same generation in which Charles Martel is engineering the now de facto usurped Merovingian empire, not just by him, but all those who had gradually eaten it up, like with at the decline of the Frankish kingdom, that now is reactivating, for the creation of literally a military class of heavy cavalrymen that could start living off like as professionals of their mounted warfare, and with the entire society essentially starting to revolve finally around them. This was already the case, especially for Gaul, from quite a while, but never to the extent that the Franks, after this continuous hammering of surrounding peoples by the masters of palace, this Austrasian clan that managed eventually to substitute the Merovingian sacred blood and becoming their own in that regard, would carry out. There are some attempts, scholarly speaking, to predate the introduction of the stirrup in these areas. Doesn't matter whether by the 8th century the stirrup becomes sort of systemically relevant. It's possible that the Germans knew this, as we were saying before, to a substantial degree since the late 6th century, right? What is paradoxical is that while there are studies that date even to the first half of the 20th century that investigated this thing, today people don't seem to care too much about this. There is the evidence from an Alsatian tomb containing an entire equestrian equipment of an Alemannic leader that is quite authoritative, and the find dates back to the second half of the 7th century, but it does not include stirrups. All right. The latest dating for stirrups discovered during the excavations in East Prussia and Lithuania would lead to the late 7th, early 8th century. So contemporary somewhat to the development of the stirrup in Persia. We do not know how much interdependence exists. In this case, our type stirrups would appear, for example, towards the end of the 8th century in the right bank of the Rhine and in Scandinavia. But again, we do not have to even recur to the idea of maybe there was some organic stirrup of sort to obviously be aware, given the general scantiness of this evidence, that just we got so few stirrups that of course there would have been many more out there, and that surely if you go back in time and you would have seen many more than the ones that we can see today. So I'm a proponent, again, mostly because I'm an anti-technologist in the historical sense, that of course the stirrup was there God knows since when, centuries before this time, but only at this time we start finding it to this degree, which suggests that it's starting to become something more relevant, more systematic. And at that point, the question is not when the stirrup was first introduced, but why was spreading at that point from the within of these peoples, as far as we're concerned. And this, and it goes without saying that if we look at the 7th, the 8th century, if Christianization had not arrived, we would know much more because of the burials. There is a very interesting anecdote from Saint Boniface and his missionaries, who would tend to emphasize while converting these Germanic peoples that those who ascended to heaven did not need a horse to do so, which is quite fascinating, as let's say the horse was a universal symbol of divine transfiguration. So the idea is that the warrior, the hero, elevates himself towards heaven if he knows how to tame this prestigious, this mighty horse. This a bit of a dual symbol in all Indo-European mythologies, right? But Christianity, and I made a video about this paradigm shift, was emphasizing the fact that it's all a spiritual preparation. It's not the material wealth of the horse that had to be buried in a funeral to show the others that you were rich, etc. That really mattered. It was about the spirit that you tamed. In other words, he said, you do not need a horse to ascend heaven, but it's not necessary that you will not ascend heaven without a horse, right? And think about Bernard of Clairvaux and the Laude Nove Militia. I made a video specifically about self-sacrifice in holy combat from Arjuna to the Templars, that talks about, of course, the continuity also in Christian times, absolutely, with the belief of transfiguration in holy combat, and the horse was very important in this as well, right? Just the contemporaneity between the beginning of Boniface's missionaries' successes and the presumed introduction of the stirrup has probably deprived us of the expression of more precise datings. But we can imagine more or less what was going on, right? This is important statistically. We see, after all, how and when things started to matter. Like this entire video is to point out that certain questions are on the basis of today's evidence. That is also pretty much most of what we're going to, well, archaeologically maybe we're going to find a lot more, but in general, like history, like you can find archaeologically these finds, but you're not to reconstruct armies just on the basis of that, right? It's a completely different thing. Archaeology does not do that. 95% of military history is history, it's not archaeology. But to make you understand how important it is to focus on the things that actually matter, not on the ones that you can write so much about, but that is not so or too relevant in this regard. I don't know, in this time, for example, the Scandinavians are still pagan, but we do not find this enormous lot of evidence compared to eventually what is already like in throughout all these centuries, continental Europe, right, is kind of obvious. Aside from the fact that Scandinavia, in the same way in which it was not Christian, yet it was also not particularly developed, compared especially to these other countries. So we also know less just archaeologically as a consequence, less people, less material wealth, and more. There are also not just archaeological sources in general. The iconographic ones are known to be relatively unreliable, at least when they had to render, especially some technical details, but they are also very, very relevant. In any case, other evidence does show how the use of stirrup did become, in fact, widespread in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, starting especially from the mid-8th century, which also corresponds, by the way, to a generalized revival, demographically, economically. So it's not even per se just the fruit of some technically deterministic issue, which flattens the let's say the increase just per se, right? It's a very gradual phenomenon. There is no magical, again, revolution at this point. The verbs insalire and desalire, previously used to indicate mounting and dismounting from a horse, however, were around just this time replaced by verbs as scandere and descendere, which means, literally, in fact, to descend, to just climb down, right? So indicating more gradual movements than a jump, verbs that were already in use before, but only now taking on a generalized semantic role, which is different from saying, okay, from a day to another they began to think that they had to jump on or off on horseback, as opposed to rising, mounting on horseback, or descending from horseback, or whatever. These terms had already been used in antiquity, in Latin in this case, in the wide literature in this language, of course, about military affairs, for, in fact, cavalry, right? It's just that, let's say, the vassalic beneficiary system kicks in together with the military elite that is becoming ever more identifiable, and together with that there are specific values and mechanisms that are also commonly associated to them from a cultural point of view as well. Contemporary to the mid-8th century, there was also a significant series of modifications in the offensive weapons that we have discussed for cavalry. But for example, when you look at the typical weapons of the infantry up to that point, the Angon and the Francisca among the Franks, but also about among other peoples. We'll make a video about this. I made a video about the Frankish infantrymen, by the way, if you're interested in the same period. You will, there are other that remain, such as the battle axe that the Anglo-Saxons kept using on foot, also the Scandinavians later on. Think about Hastings and how William the Conqueror had to reckon with it. But these others, again, the more attached to the migration era, in fact, and the Francisca is not. It's more like the double-handed axe is really more like a Frankish Carolingian thing rather than a Danish thing, for example. So double-handed axe is not much out there during the actual Germanic times of the migration era. The Angon and Francisca are, and they are reflective of what I was saying before, that the infantry, the freemen, were better armed at the beginning. Well, at this point, you don't find that much anymore, because these people are losing power, socially and militarily, and these weapons disappear as such, while the typically aristocratic weapons that become, in fact, ever better suited for mounted combat, talking about the longsword, the spada, right, lengthened even further, right? A proof not only of a decisive improvement, by the way, in metallurgical technique. In the Rhineland, the Carolingians were, of course, controlling and developing further, but also the fact that there was an increasing tendency to use the weapon from the height of the saddle. The spada, never made a video about this, but we talked about the ancient sword and how this weapon had developed. Of course, had a very advanced barycenter towards the tip, which made it great for slashing and even more effective to do so from top to bottom from horseback. Look at the Gallic neck guards, and you'll understand that so why the Romans adopted it, even though it was still mostly about infantry warfare. And okay, that design was not just because of the spada, but can argue mostly, almost. Well, at this point, the cavalry sword is becoming ever more performing, ever bigger, ever longer, and designed to reach at ever greater distance. This increases in parallel with, of course, the training of the individual, that again is becoming part of a professional elite. And so it is clear that a strike drone aiming the feet on the stirrups to rise on the saddle is a blow that receives energy not only from the strength of the arm, but from the weight of the entire body, as we were recalling before. So this is not much to say that here we're not in the steppes, right? So there had been another development. The Germans, paradoxically the Western ones like the Franks, had been among the least of the entire group to make use of cavalry. Just the peoples like the Anglo-Saxons, the Scandinavians made less use of cavalry, say in the 6th century. Even though they're heroes, think about the Vandal era ones, in the iconography, like they're always horsemen, like in any other Indo-European context. But reality is different. And so, as we've seen, the Franks considered mostly the Goths and the Longobards as the actual cavalry guys, right? And as we've seen here with the Angan, with Francesca, the infantry element was quite powerful. So while heavy cavalry did exist among the Franks, say in Clovis times, this was not so massively developed to even bring the average weapon to be so ultra advanced, because on many instances the same Frankish counts would have to fight dismounted, which was actually a frequent convenience. It would remain for a long time yet. What starts happening from the mid-8th century instead is that mounted warfare takes on an increasingly systemic and structural role, and with that, weapons adequate as well. Even the metallurgical techniques are a consequence of this. There's someone who pushes for having better performing swords on horseback. It's not that the design of the spada changes dramatically. It's basically the same sword, but it increases towards that direction. And so these guys are unitly becoming gradually something else, something more elite. And so do not underestimate, as we were saying before, the collective dimension. This is not just about how much a knight would lose balance, for example, on horseback by missing a strike and so needing the stirrup. This is also about the fact that there are ever larger forces of collectively trained, heavily armored horsemen that will much more regularly smash into each other at high speed in tough compaction, that need the stirrup to maintain balance in that situation. Perhaps breaking themselves in two, whatever, but needing to stay much more tied to their saddles than before. This is, I think, the single most important factor technically for the development of the stirrup at that point. That of course reflects this major military development as a collective force, right? It's also not a surprise that For example, the Skrammas axe, especially in Carolingian Europe, tends to disappear, right? And this remains among surrounding peoples, the Saxons, for example. Why? Because, especially the continental ones are conquered by the Franks, but the sense is that the Skrammas axe served some sort of more multitasking type of trooper out there in the wild, even in single combat, whatever. At this point, a true miles is a guy that fights in ever more in formation, and so you will have a side weapon, as medieval knights would always maintain, but the importance of the Skrammas axe and its form as the Langsax, that, as we've seen, had sort of increased at some point in different parts of the Romano-Germanic world, tend to disappear because its function is too well replaced by the sword, that is just such a more smashing thing and a much more, let's say, unopposed one, because there is not properly even a social class that challenges the mounted elite. And actually the peoples that made more use of the Skrammas axe, in fact, are the ones wiped out by the Carolingians, which is very fascinating. There is also another interesting aspect, the composite bow of Central Asian type, that surely the Avars, among other peoples, had contributed to bring to Europe, but in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, for example, it had always been sort of frequent, like the Balkan and Levantine auxiliaries had been using it quite far and wide, even in early imperial time. This weapon spreads both for foot and soldiers and for knights. This doesn't go too west than Germany or Italy, that were areas that were still close to eventually the Magyars, the Byzantines, and so peoples in general that made use of these weapons. And even though in terms of equipment the difference between cavalry and infantry was not yet clear, what is clear is that there is an elite in the two arms that is also just the same guys sometimes as they mount and dismount, as we've seen, that become ever more multitask, right? So this is a sort of tiny bit what with the feudalization of warfare increased a bit, like, I don't know, the early Saka warriors that could handle both shock and missile function, right? In charge of, say, melee and missile capacity. This is not like something that would develop dramatically in the West, but we tend to forget how much especially the aristocracy was trained to fight, for example, as horse archers. I mean, literally all medieval knights knew how to be horse archers. If anything, they went hunting like that, and they would also make use of missile side weapons much more often than what the chivalric idealism tries to conceal, right? This, for example, knowing how to shoot from horseback needs more stability on the mount, right? So the saddle, the stirrups would provide with this increasingly, right? There was also in these weapons greater penetrating power, which was particularly useful against heavily armored opponents that, as we've seen, are the equivalent against which the same guys sort of fight, because think about the Carolingian civil wars, right? But there are also steppes enemies, like the Magyars, for example, that are coming. Also the Arabs, the Saracens that invade from the Mediterranean are provided with the composite bow, right? So it's not like in Western Europe you don't find too much composites, but already in places, again, like on the Magyar frontier in Germany or like in southern Italy, you do find this weapon, right? All this, in terms cause effect and vice versa, brings to the use of some sort of brigandines and halbergs. We'll talk about the brunias later, but we know what these weapons were. This armor were like some leather armor studded with metal plates, or the coat of mail, etc. This increases, like you need ever wealthier horsemen endowed with large amounts of land to afford this stuff. The war horse training all their lives, and this makes these guys ever heavier and functional to an ever more developed type of combat, and just armor will become ever heavier over time. Because if you look at the 13th century knight, like, it's not essentially different from a Carolingian one in the most elementary elements, but overall, right? And in contemporary to this, there are significant changes in other fields. There is an interesting aspect to notice here, that the brunia, compared to, for example, the scaly clothes of the cataphracts, or even the variously heavy Roman armor, in fact, that had been used for the same, represent a relatively crude invention, right? They were fairly sophisticated. Actually, we have very scanty archaeological evidence. We don't have intact, for example, we don't have any full Longobard armor. Also, how the brunia was actually made among the Franks is, quite conjectural to some extent, but it did meet the various requirements of relatively low cost and practicality. When you look at the cataphract armor and how it developed in the steppe, it developed for an elite, an ultra elite. This is the case in the steppes. You have an ultra shockingly, traumatically, violently developed, heavily armored horseman as the chief, and then you have all poor, cheap, naked horse archers. There is basically not something in between, right? There is in theory, but it's compared to the sanitary world. It's an incredible imbalance, an incredible, divide between the very elite and the mostly the subject tribes that had been broken, whose elite had been literally taken out, and so you had only the stripped horse archers in large numbers that were just not decisive, even though being overwhelmingly superior from a numerical point of view to the heavies, right? In the West, it's different. Here, as we've seen, it's a world rising again from a fairly widespread wealth. I mean, even after feudalism, Europe would maintain a more evenly distributed wealth than, say, China, and especially the steppes. But it shows how the same Western cavalry was evolving not from an imitation of the East, but from an internal system. Right? If you do not see what Gallic society was in Carolingian times, you cannot understand why the heaviest and most effective cavalry out there on a systemic basis developed. So, of course, the steppe would never have the upper hand over the sanitary world, because the sanitary world was superior in many ways. So, in conclusion of this video, like, when you look at the developments of Western equestrian culture, there is no need to go fish like the direct influence from the East. Doesn't matter how much this existed to some extent, it's incomparable to the actual substratum that Western Europe had maintained. So comparing the brunia to the cataphract armor just per se doesn't make sense in itself, because the brunia was a nice garment in the sanitary world. It would have been too heavy for and bulky for infantry. It was, however, still very importantly developed in this sedentary societies compared to the nomadic ones, hindering the necessary free movements in hand-to-hand combat, and reduced. Talking about an ideally cataphract armor, like instead of the Brunia, right? So something cheaper after all. And so, for even what you had to do in mounted combat at this point also meant more frequently dismounting, surely than what the steppe guy would normally do. Well, the Brunia was the response to all this and to the increasing weight and effectiveness of offensive weapons such as the spada, the arrow launched from the composite bow of the Magyars, say, and would did win in the end. Alright, obviously the sedentaries. Look at the Battle of the Lech and how the Eastern Frankish knights managed to cope with Magyar tactics. I made some videos about this, and we will keep seeing it better in detail some other point. So again, never underestimate the West, never underestimate the resourcefulness, the resilience of it. Never look at early medieval Europe and saying, but Latin Germanic Europe for some reason was backwards. Why? Because somebody convinced you that looking at exotic things like Constantinople or the Caliphate means to look at ipso facto more developed places. The more I studied early medieval European history, the Western one, the more I realized how advanced the system was, to a degree that those cultures never quite had the capacity to match, to beat, to overwhelm, to crack. If we're not talking about the steppes, right? So I made so many videos about steppes warfare that I am above suspicion in terms of bias, even when I openly declare my Western one. But in fact, this is something stemming from my studies. I learned this after I had been told certain things that objectively were not true, such as, oh my god, look at the cataphracts, the most beautiful thing that ever happened. Yes, and then? We explain how these were a reaction actually to a sedentary civilization. The Sakas, again, invented that because of Alexander's phalangites and heavy cavalry, by the way. The sedentaries were surely doing their own thing. Like the migration era is not a proof of a victory of the nomads at all, as also Attila's demise, predictably a predictable one, by the way, clearly shows, and more, starting from the Avars, the Magyars, the Bulgars. In a way or another, they are knocked out. Same goes for the Mongols later. And so it's rather an impressionistic, emotionalistic, and defeatistic approach that it seems now that everything the West does, oh my god, we're going to fail. We're not going to fail. Just be very careful. But when we do set things in motion, the other side has to be extremely careful, if not to back down immediately, because the consequences are quicker to arrive at that point. And this is my just 2 cents, but I think that we will naturally keep talking about the stirrup at some point. This was perhaps one of the most centered videos I will make on it, because again, as I was saying before, it's not that I consider it as a waste of time, but it's more about debunking the deterministic technologistic bias than any other specific aspect. Understand how important culture is, but understand why this changes, and do not overestimate, let's say, the external influence over a civilization when the civilization changes per se. Right, it's much more about the fruit of civilization than the external input, in a way or another. In any case, for today, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.